And thanks everyone for joining the Boston 365 user group in our April 2022 session. We just have a few intro slides before we get to our main event. So we'd like to just introduce our organizers. So if you have any feedback, good, bad, or otherwise, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always looking to improve the group. So we have myself, Dimitri, I'm a partner at Turn Digital. We have Mike, who's a senior consultant at Wellington Street Consulting. And we have Bill Gunning, who's a technical lead at ETOS, part of the state of Massachusetts. And since Mike's now on camera, if you have any complaints, you can send that his way today. So if you didn't have a chance to meet with us last month, we had an excellent session by Chris Bortlick looking at an architect's view of SharePoint syntax, Viva topics, and why they're better together. We do have it posted on our YouTube channel, so if you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out. Chris, as always, gave a great presentation. So meanwhile, updates since we last met. And here we try to summarize the best, or at least the most interesting aspects that were announced in the last 4 weeks, give or take. Of course, this is not comprehensive, but we think you might be interested here. So the first item is around the view-only guidance update. So Microsoft released a notification last 2 weeks ago about mentioning that meetings, with 1,000 people can be attended using a regular Teams meeting without having to go into the Teams live event. And there was a lot of confusion in terms of, whether Microsoft was signaling that regular meetings are taking over and replacing live events, or sort of when to use what type. And Microsoft just came out and clarified that, live events are still the appropriate venue for large-scale events with over 1,000 people. And while it is true that you can now have up to 1,000 join a regular Teams meeting, you still lose a lot of information, like, people over a certain amount can no longer participate in the meeting. They could just view it. You miss the attendance reports, Q&A capabilities, and the list continues. So for those that got very excited earlier, just make sure that that there are different products for different use cases. Moving forward, Microsoft made a licensing shift. So previously, if you wanted to use Project Online, you needed to have one of the licenses, anywhere from Plan 1 through Plan 5. With the new update, Microsoft, as many of you know, have released a more modern version of Project in the Web, and they call it Project for the Web, which is different than Project Online, but it's part of the same family. So with this new Project for the Web, which essentially looks just like Planner, except it has the ability to have dependencies between tasks, so you get nice chart views and Gantt views and things that you would expect out of a project plan. But the new announcement is that if you have O365 E3 or E5, you no longer need a separate license for Project for the Web in order to work and update the tasks that you're assigned to. Which means now you can have a few project managers that have the Project for the Web licenses, and as they dole out tasks, individuals can come back and update their progress, mark it as complete, change the status, etc., without having to be subscribed separately. So a very welcome change, and I think this will help drive the adoption of this platform. Moving forward, so for those of you that have Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, there's a feature that is called, Safe Attachments. And Safe Attachments essentially scans your emails as they're coming in. If they have attachments, it takes those attachments, it puts them into an isolated environment. It does what Microsoft calls detonates them, which basically means it tries to run them. And then it looks for suspicious activity, things like registry changes or memory reads or things that it's not, no benign attachment would actually do, but it does a very good job at finding malware or viruses or things that are malicious in nature. And when you configure this, there's really two policies. One is that you can have all mail be delayed that has an attachment until the attachment's been detonated and proven to be safe. Or you can deliver the body of the email message, but just delay the attachment from appearing in Outlook. And within Outlook, you'd see the sign that says, your attachment's still being scanned. Please check back later. So a lot of individuals have been concerned because if there's a large volume of email or if there's especially large attachments, sometimes it could take hours or longer for all of those attachments to be processed. So Microsoft is introducing a new mail latency report, which gives you a better picture of how many messages are coming in through your tenant with attachments, and on average, how long it takes to go and detonate those attachments and understand what they are and what's going on. So this gives you a little bit more insight, which could maybe help you craft different policies. Where if you have a safe sender that's constantly sending you large media files, you might whitelist them or handle the antivirus through your endpoints. So it just gives you a little bit more control. But the first step to that control is to understand what the problem is, if any. Next update. So Microsoft Lists now has a modern calendar view, which is also available for SharePoint lists inside SharePoint sites. And when Microsoft released Modern, they pivoted a bit in the way that they handle required fields. So with classic mode, if you had a required field, you couldn't save an item until that metadata was filled in properly. In Modern, they allow you to save it even if the required fields are missing. And then if you're in list view, you get like a red highlight saying that you're missing key information. But that's not quite apparent in a calendar view because you don't really have the ability to see that. So if you are saving a calendar item that does not have the start date or the end date or the critical metadata it needs to actually show it on the calendar view, there's going to be a new column or a new tab here on the right side that's going to show you unscheduled events. And these are essentially things that you've entered, but just a reminder, they're not actually going to be appearing on the view until you fill in all the necessary information. So welcome change here. Next update. So Office 2013 is officially out of support, out of mainstream support, that is. And it's going to be ending with extended support about a year from now, which means Microsoft will no longer be releasing security updates. It's no longer be considered a secure platform to use for any kind of productivity. I know we still have some clients that are on 2013, but this is a good runway of 12 months to start planning to move off of 2013. And of course, the natural choice is to move to M365 apps or have it bundled with Business Premium or E3 or higher. But you can still buy the standalone 2019 versions of Office if need be.
So I think the biggest impact for us is probably the SharePoint Designer workflows, 2013 workflows, right?
To be honest, I don't know if SharePoint Designer 2013 has had any updates in a while. I know they released an update. Sorry, go ahead.
My understanding it was supposed to be deprecated in 2023, so I'm wondering if this is the date for that deprecation.
So keep in mind, SharePoint Designer 2013 was kind of dead for a while, and with modern authentication, Microsoft came back, released a new version of Designer 2013, so you could log into with MFA and things like that into appropriate environments. SharePoint Designer workflows for SharePoint Designer 2013 workflows for SharePoint Online still work technically if you're still running them. Deprecating a piece of software doesn't mean it stops working. It just means it stopped being patched, and Microsoft won't help you if you do run into a problem with it. So I suspect that version that you have will probably continue to live on and work for SharePoint Designer as necessary. But that being said, Microsoft is really trying hard to get away from SharePoint Designer as much as possible. And in fact, none of the modern stuff besides those 2013 workflows that are legacy can really be modified with SharePoint Designer today. Good point, Deb. So next up, so this is a welcome change. So we know we've had page templates that we could create for some time now, for press releases or executive bios, things that you would commonly find across an intranet. Microsoft's now expanding that template framework and allowing us to create section templates. Where if for those that are familiar with WordPress or other CMS platforms, a section template lets you just plug and play pre-configured web parts that are showing you different, not just columns, but also different data views, different images, just making it that much faster for somebody to click in and populate content as opposed to worrying about the layouts and how to display that content. So there's going to be 6 of them to begin with, and we expect to see this continuing to expand as Microsoft matures further in this space as well. All right, so thanks to Turn Digital for being the platinum sponsor of our user group. They help keep the lights on, deal with all the legal and regulatory fees, and back when we're in person again, we'll be happy to pick up the pizzas and tabs as well. Shooting performance issues in SharePoint Online sites with Sean P. Donahue. So Sean, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. As I warned Dimitri at the outset of our conversation, my home office tends to get warm, and so I'm already feeling my heat level go up. My doors are closed. There's no airflow. So if I start sweating, it's not that I'm questioning the information I'm giving you. It's just I'm literally getting hot. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule to hang out with us this evening. Let me share my screen. There we go. Okay. So we are going to talk about troubleshooting performance issues in SharePoint Online sites this evening. This talk kind of came out of, frankly, 10 or 15 years worth of work in the SharePoint space, primarily oriented around performance and optimizing page throughput, first in SharePoint on-prem and now in SharePoint Online. I've got a long history with this. But before I get too far into that, let me share a little bit about myself. Make sure, trying to get, there we go. Too many windows. So my name is Sean McDonough. I currently live in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I've lived for the last 30 plus years. I'm originally from New England, born in Connecticut, spent some time in Vermont before moving down to Ohio. I started my professional career as a polymer chemist with Procter & Gamble. P&G is a large enough company that it allows you to make kind of lateral transitions if you want to start doing something new. My love was always computers and writing software, so I did not really see myself growing old as a chemist. It was pretty interesting at points, but I took more to the computers. I've been developing software professionally since the mid-90s, and I've focused primarily on SharePoint since 2004. So for anybody who's a part of the Wayback Machine with me, we're talking about SharePoint Portal Server 2003. I didn't spend any time with Team Services 2001 or Tahoe Server. Those predate me, but I did get my feet wet in 2003 and every version after. I was fortunate enough to be awarded the Microsoft MVP in 2016 and every year since. I am now in Office Apps and Services, where they put all us SharePoint dinosaurs these days. But nowadays, I've been a consultant over the years. I've worked in many different industries. These days, I do independent consulting as Bitstream Foundry, which is my LLC here in Cincinnati. Most of what I do is oriented around Microsoft 365, big surprise, and Acumatica-based intranet creation and support. So just up the road from you guys over the border in New Hampshire is Acumatica. I know they sponsored many different events in the Boston area for various SharePoint gatherings. But I work with those folks and rolling out their product and designing intranets based on it. I'm also, I do work on operational performance-based troubleshooting and remediation. So trying to help people figure out why things are slow and what they can do about it. I also do just plain old custom development. I was doing, .NET development before SharePoint, and prior to .NET development, did COM-based development. So I've got a long history in Microsoft development technologies. These days, it seems to be mostly JavaScript. I do write PowerShell scripts, things like that, but I'll occasionally build a full trust or standalone application and roll it out. My wife is a psychologist and has a nonprofit designed to raise awareness for people living with schizophrenia, and so I'm involved with that. I'm their CTO. And try to keep their website running, sharing information, etc. So that's a little bit about me. So let's talk about performance and specifically the agenda for this talk. So some of these might be intriguing. Some of them you may wonder about, but I want to talk first about a little bit about born on dates. Anybody who's seen the Budweiser commercials with the born on date, that's what I'm talking about. I would then want to move on to what I call one tool to rule them all. Understanding page metrics, building your SPO site, SharePoint Online troubleshooting guidance, Q&A, et cetera, et cetera. Please feel free to raise a hand and essentially get my attention during the talk. Dimitri, I'll ask you, because I can't really see the chat window right now. So if somebody says something or raises their hand, wants to get my attention, please call it out for me.
Absolutely.
Thank you. But we're going to focus on, you'll see there's a theme throughout this beyond performance, and hopefully you'll catch on. So moving right along. So let's talk about born on dates. And this is the standard disclaimer that everybody gives regarding Microsoft 365. Microsoft calls Microsoft 365 an evergreen service, which sounds awfully nice, piney, kind of fragrant. Really what it means is anything you do on the service generally has a shelf life. Things are rolling over all the time. The service is constantly changing. It can take weeks and months to roll a feature out completely to all the tenants in the Microsoft Online space. But, your given version for all the various applications and services in your tenant likely isn't going to match someone else's exact set of services by version, major, minor, revision, build. So it's constantly changing. And so one thing most of us in the cloud space have learned to do was get used to the fact that, if we don't like something, we can probably just wait it out. It's going to change tomorrow or the day after. And that's been the cadence that Microsoft has maintained for quite a few years now. The reason I bring this up is because once I put this out on the web, and it is out on my site right now, I've got your specific version that I'm giving right now out on my blog, and I'll have that at the end to share with you so if you want to go get the slides. But inevitably, information we put out, my blog's been going for quite a few years, and I know that some of my blog posts have not held up well over time, particularly around the early cloud app model that was rolled out for SharePoint. So what I'm asking is that you please don't look me up in 5 years and send me what I call fan mail, indicating that I've got it all wrong and I don't know SharePoint Online. Chances are, I'll freely admit there are plenty of things I don't know about SharePoint Online. But as of right now, this information is relevant and fresh. Now, if you wait a week, it'll probably still be that way. You get out a month, it's time to start thinking. 6 months, a year, really time to start considering whether or not the information you're paying attention to is accurate, relevant, and up to date. What I tell folks who go looking for information on the web, you can find pretty much an article to support any perspective you have on technology. The key is to look at the date it was written and what it was written about. Particularly the date it was written. That's the one that I keep coming back to for folks, because you will find plenty of cases where Microsoft has flip-flopped over the years in guidance, and it has evolved, and there are reasons for those flip-flops, and they make sense when you consider the timeline. But if you take things in the abstract and just focus on one small point, it can be really confusing. So dates are the best way we have to at least do an initial acid test for anything we might find. So one tool to rule them all, and some of you might recognize the one ring over there on the right. The one tool to rule them all, when I started talking about SharePoint performance, it was an entirely manual effort. Any performance diagnostics you wanted to do often involved Fiddler and a lot of mathematics, reading request and response headers, dissecting server logs, perhaps looking at packet traces, things like that. Nowadays, we actually have a tool that we can use for many of the performance troubleshooting steps we might want to take. It's called the Page Diagnostics tool for SharePoint. And if any of you are familiar with this, you're going to understand, of course, why I'm talking about it, because this tool itself was written specifically to address the case of what can I do to make my site more performant? I've got a SharePoint Online site. I don't like how it's performing. What's wrong with it? Well, this tool can tell you. And it's currently in version 2.1.6. Version 1.0 came out quite a few years back at one of the once the Microsoft SharePoint conference rebooted. It was released that year, quickly got a number of updates. We're now in version 2.16. This is a browser extension from Microsoft. Interestingly enough, it was made first for Google Chrome. The intention was to bring it over to Edge. It does actually work with Edge now that Edge is Chromium, and they've updated the tool to actually recognize that. You could have used the tool previously with Chromium, any of the Chromium browsers, but Microsoft has given first-class support to Edge now, unsurprisingly. And what it does, this tool analyzes pages, both modern and classic. Initially, the tool initially did just classic. It does modern pages now, which most people are trying to run or looking to convert to. You get page data and statistics out of it. The nice thing is it gives you plain English analysis of what it sees in your site based on a number of rules that are authored and constantly updated based on what Microsoft publishes as guidance for building your sites. It's really good to use as a diagnostic tool. It can also make you feel good that you've got everything covered. You just need to run it, take a look at what it says, and if you get greens up and down the board, you're good. So the data can also be exported for further analysis. I don't know if any of you are regular Fiddler users or you have any other dissection tools for HTTP archives, but you can export the trace that the page diagnostics tool captures and do further analysis in any tool that can import a .har file like Fiddler. I've got a link on my blog where I talk about this, one tool to rule them all, kind of the initial how it got going, where we are with it. Got that link here. This is a completely free extension that you can get in the MS Edge or Chrome download store. So what does it actually give us in terms of diagnostics? Well, there are certain response headers that SharePoint has been putting out for years that help us gain a little bit of insight into what's going on the web front end that's processing our pages. So we make a request out to a SharePoint site. The SharePoint web front end that's processing our request does what it needs to do to build the page and then sends it back. But we have certain headers that are included in that page, and specifically the ones that are of interest to us as we are trying to troubleshoot. Let's see here. Okay, so here we go. So SP request duration, SP IIS latency, page load time, as well as a request GUID that allows us to tie our request that we might make to SharePoint Online back to the processing that's done on the back end. Now, the reason we need all these things, they were available prior to SharePoint Online, but prior to SharePoint Online, we also had other ways to get performance information. Oftentimes, we could sit and watch IIS logs and performance counters on Windows servers serving up our pages, and we could tell if a SharePoint environment was performing relatively well or relatively poorly. But now that we only have one half of the equation available to us, which is the client side, we have to use what's available to us. And, you know, we no longer have access to the sorts of logs that we had when we might have run SharePoint on-prem. If you're still running on-prem, well, congratulations, you've got a lot more diagnostic information at your disposal. But for everyone else who's in the cloud, these are what we have. And I will talk about what these mean, but these numbers mean a lot to us as we try to figure out what we're seeing in terms of our page performance, as well as these numbers help to indicate where we might look to solve some problems. So the diagnostics tool also gives us our page URL, which is important for the memory impaired like me. We get to see exactly what page we're requesting. Now these metrics, like I said, they've been available for a while, but previously we had to use tools like Fiddler, and we had to know how to dissect pages, understand response headers, things like that. This page diagnostics tool basically takes all of that and wraps it up into one easy to use package. So one thing we don't have anymore for you SharePoint admins out there who might remember, it's called the X-SharePoint Health Score response header. And this is something that the server would send you on the client side, and it would be a number between 0 and 10. 0 would mean that the web front end that served up your page was performing with almost no load, nothing to do, 0 impediments. It had tons of headroom. And that number would go up as the server was getting greater and greater stress and more that it had to do. So by the time you were getting up to numbers like 7 and 8, what was happening on the server side is that SharePoint would start shutting down selective processes, things like low priority timer jobs, certain search crawls, lots of background activity, everything it could shut down in order to make enough headroom to process all the pages until it could get that SharePoint health score back down. And the reason I mention this is even though you don't get it, you can still pull it out of a response header. And this is a good number to know about simply because one thing you probably don't think too much about is the SharePoint Online environment is a cloud environment. You may think of a large farm in the on-prem sense as maybe having 10 web front ends. Well, a SharePoint Online environment has hundreds of them. And what it's doing at all times is monitoring the load of the environment. And if the environment is consistently under load, it used to be if it was constantly over 40% web front end load, as far as the CPU is concerned, there's an automated provisioning process that would start adding additional web front ends to that environment until it got to the point where it was where it had enough processing power and headroom to service all the page requests. Well, an early canary in the coal mine, if you're used to plucking out response headers, is if you see a SharePoint health score that's constantly coming back high, there's a good chance that Microsoft, that automated provisioning process is going to start rolling out additional front ends and adding them to your environment. So that's just one indicator you can use to kind of get the transient feel, the wet finger in the wind of where your farm is. So I'm going to discuss the specific, what these specific things are, SP request duration and IIS latency specifically. But there's an equation I'm going to come back to, and I want you guys to remember. And that is the page load time minus the sum of the latency and request duration equals something I call TLE, which is time lost elsewhere. And I'll have an illustrative example here very shortly, but I'm just introducing that because that number, this TLE, can oftentimes indicate where we might have a problem if we've got poor page performance or what we perceive to be poor page performance. So coming back to the diagnostics tool, the rules that are run as far as the diagnostics tests go, they are, navigational implementation check. So if you still have structural navigation running on your site, which is generally poorly performing in the cloud environment, this rule will flag that as something you need to fix. If you're trying to test your page performance in anything other than a standard user, for instance, if you try to test it as an admin, you don't get a good read of what page performance is for your users, and the tool will call that out. Various image checks. So if you're uploading large images and not resizing them or reducing fidelity with like a JPEG compression, the tool will flag that. Whether or not you're using content delivery networks. Content delivery networks are very big components and very big players in the SharePoint performance space. They're in the performance space for all sites, but SharePoint in particular. The way that we get such good performance, generally speaking, from SharePoint Online nowadays has a lot to do with content delivery networks. Whether or not you're using the content query part, server request count checks, am I calling back to SharePoint too often to get page data? All of these sorts of checks and others are embodied within the page diagnostics tool. So when these rules are run, and they're run anytime you execute a test, your results will come back color coded. Green, like a stoplight, green is good, red is bad, yellow is something you might want to be concerned about. The other fantastic part about the page diagnostics tool, there are extensive in-product links to relevant Microsoft articles. And this, if you're new or getting your feet wet with SharePoint performance, these links help you understand why the tool is telling you things are okay or things need help. You follow the link, it'll explain what you want to do and why it's important. And that will give you additional context and understanding as to why that rule happened to be green, red, or yellow like it did.
So, Sean, one quick question for you in the chat here.
Sure.
So Russell is asking if there's any kind of PowerShell commands to view the server logs for SharePoint Online.
I want to say that there's some access to logs, but I don't actually know the PowerShell for it. The problem with trying to view server logs is since there are often hundreds of web front ends in an environment, those logs have to be aggregated from multiple servers, virtualized servers that are established to service the tenant. I know that that's done, and I know that you can take the correlation ID that the tool gives you, and support can use that to refer back to the logs. The missing piece I don't specifically know is how you might get access to some of those same logs, because I know there is access to some server-side logs. I just don't know which ones. So if you want to send me a note, please feel free. That's something I'd actually be interested in finding out myself.
I got a quick question. This is Bill.
Sure.
The web front end service change tenant by tenant, or is it just what Microsoft has available that day?
They are specific to a tenant. So if you're in a tenant and you're all in, you're with 100 of your closest friends all sharing the same hardware, that hardware is specific to your environment. So the front ends that are servicing your requests are different than the front ends that are servicing somebody else in a different tenant's request.
So that's what the score comes in handy, and keeping an eye on that headroom with the web front ends.
Right. So I would say that this, it's good to have that information and to know that you've got that at your disposal. But, we've gotten to the point where Microsoft they've really tuned things. SharePoint Online's been running for how many years now? And I'm not counting the BPAWS days, but they've been eating their own dog food for so long now that it is very responsive in terms of adding capabilities, adding headroom by adding web front ends. And in fact, one of the things we'll talk about, I think, towards the end of this presentation is if you're looking to roll out a portal, they give you specific guidance so that you can use those elastic mechanisms to your advantage. A lot of organizations want to do a big bang release, turn it on and let the world come for a new intranet, let's say. That's exactly 180 degrees out of alignment with how it should be rolled out. It should be rolled out to smaller groups over time. And what that allows is the elastic mechanisms to respond to that ever increasing load so you can stair step up. So, but I think we'll look at that a little bit. Yeah, it's a good question.
And Sean, we have one more in the chat before we continue. So Mike asks, would you recommend using a CDN for small companies, a couple of offices, all offices and remote staff local to Massachusetts? Does the use of CDN introduce any kind of lag in the propagation of changes to a site?
Those are good questions. So CDNs benefit everybody regardless of size, and I'll explain that. CDNs, in addition to a CDN, a content delivery network, is essentially we're taking a single piece of information, a file that normally would reside in a single location, and we're creating copies of it all over the world, typically in a CDN. And so a CDN takes advantage of the fact that there's likely a closer copy of a file you're requesting to you that you can request, one that cuts down on latency and lag that you might have fetching the original file. It also means that, the closer we have connections to data, there's a better chance that we have higher bandwidth to get those pieces of data as well. So that's one problem the CDN solves, and that's the one that kind of makes sense. The one that a lot of folks don't know about is CDNs, typically when they send data down to your system, they include cacheability headers. So public cacheability headers that allow your browser to store that data and oftentimes reuse it across browser sessions and users for any content that's not sensitive. If it has a public cacheability header, it can be reused so that the next time you go to use that site or use that piece of data or file, you can use a local copy and not even have to make the trip out to the net for it. Now, the other part of this was, does it introduce some lag? Technically, it can. However, a properly managed CDN, the lag is minimized. When you're in heavy development, CDNs kind of get in the way in an annoying fashion because you're looking for things to typically refresh. So everybody's dumping caches and whatnot. But during normal operational conditions, if something comes down with a public cacheability header, that has a time to live on it. And once that content expires, then your machine will start calling back to the internet to get an updated copy or to see that the existing copy is still good. That process is still faster, at least if your existing copy is still good, than having to re-request the entire file. So there could be lag depending on how aggressively people are caching and whether or not they're caching the right stuff. The way that Microsoft typically does it is anything that's considered public. And the best example they do for this are, JavaScript libraries like jQuery, some of the React files, the stuff that goes into SharePoint framework. All of that stuff is most of that stuff is typical dependency JavaScript files that are going to be used across many different libraries. But by introducing those into a CDN, you get your local copy of them. And the rest of the time, that's the part of the iceberg that's underneath the waterline that's always needed for what you might be doing. Then the stuff above the waterline, you can focus on, hey, this is what I need to download right now. This is the newest part of that, or this is my business specific logic. So the CDN helps you in both those ways. It can introduce lag, but if done right, it typically introduces very little lag. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Sean.
Sure. Okay, so I promise I'll stop showing screenshots here for too long. But just to say that, the tool, the page diagnostics tool for SharePoint allows you to export that HTTP exchange. And that's the full dialogue that you've had between your browser and the SharePoint server. The HAR, which is HTTP archive file, has a .har extension. That is just a text file. It's a JSON file structure. JSON, for those who aren't developers, JavaScript object notation. It's a way for us to specify objects using specific semantics in text. But an example of one of those files is seen here. Like I said, it includes all of the requests and responses that form the dialogue between the browser and the web front end. And I typically will take these HAR archives and import them into Fiddler to get some additional context. Fiddler, if you've never used it, is a fantastic tool. It still does require a little bit of knowledge, particularly around transparent proxies and how HTTPS connections are made. But if you can work through that, it's great. But you don't even have to do that. Nowadays with Internet Explorer, and I still have Internet Explorer here. Some people still use it. But Edge, Chrome, everything just about every browser has debugging tools. If you hit F12, what you'll see is my daughter just made dinner, so that was the announcement. So all the modern browsers have debugging tools, and those are accessible through F12. F12 will give you much of the same information that Fiddler was traditionally needed for. However, the amount of context you can get on that information, the additional information you might extract from it, you don't quite have the same tool set. So you don't need to export these logs, these HAR archives, to make use of them. It's just a convenience for you if you want to use them. But if the tool does what you need it to do, you're good. And most people doing page diagnostics, the tool is fine, but you have that option. So this is just a screen and an easy way of saying that if you want to get the tool, all you need to do is go out to the extensions for Chrome or Microsoft Edge, search for page diagnostics for SharePoint, and it'll pop right up. Add that, and you can basically place an icon on your toolbar whenever you might want to use it. And like I said, I'll have these slides available for you for download afterwards if you have trouble getting it. But I'll give you a quick tour of the tool just so you can see how it works. So right now I have up a classic SharePoint site, and this still has publishing active and things like that. You'll notice that I have the page diagnostics tool in my browser. And so when I click on diagnostics tool, it pops up. All I have to do is hit start, and you'll see it goes through the process of rendering the page and collecting all the data. It's not a slow process. Depending on your page, it might take a little longer than some. But we can see right here, I've got my correlation ID, I've got the request duration and latency, the actual page load time, 1.5 seconds, which for a classic publishing page is really not bad. It points out that I need to use CDNs for some of my assets. I'm making 7 calls back to SharePoint, and I'm also in a non-user account right now. So that's some of what comes out of it, as well as no action required on these other elements. But as I mentioned before, for instance, why is this important? Well, I get a little bit of a note here, but if I click the Learn More link, it's going to take me directly to Microsoft Docs and why it's important that I test with a standard user account. So it's very nice to have that at your disposal, and the tool will call that stuff out for you. At the same time, if I'm curious as to how long it took a particular element or file to come down, I've got all of those here. The only one that it's calling out is this is a query that I had run. And so I'm seeing some search performance here. It's executing that query. That was running a little long. I've got one, which is get all apps. So that apparently is a poorly performing call in the web shell. But most of my files are returned well within time. And I can expand it and get a little bit more information on it too if I want to. So for instance, my page, this is the actual URL, the HTTP verb used, as well as it came from the mainframe, and that's where I made my call from. So that's on a publishing site, a classic publishing site. If I look at this with a modern site, which I have a SharePoint Spaces test site here, I do a lot of VR stuff as well. So if I take a modern site and look at it, the information and the guidance I'm going to get back will probably be fairly different because the modern pages structurally and architecturally are very different from classic pages and classic publishing pages. So it's interesting. It's kind of sitting there. Not sure why that is. Yes, I'm an impatient user. Oh man, it's still going. Okay, well, if we were to let this thing go through, I'll let it go and maybe come back to it. But obviously, we're having some problems.
Just finished, didn't it?
Did it? I didn't see. Ah, yeah, there we go. Now, the interesting thing is this is, I made no changes to this site. It's kind of funny because the page diagnostics tool, many of the site templates fail the initial rules on the page diagnostics tool. For instance, this page has 2 large images. It points out what those are. Public CDNs not enabled on this site. That's something I can go in and do. But Microsoft is also doing that behind the scenes. In many instances, also making 25 calls to SharePoint. I don't know what it's doing with all that. Those aren't mine. This is an unmodified page, so kind of interesting to see what comes back. But the page load time specifically it was only about a second. Now, the reason, of course, we didn't see a page is probably because one of those web service calls hung for longer than expected, and it blocked the rendering of the page. So that's one of the things that comes into play when we talk about true performance versus perceived performance. So let's talk about the actual page metrics part of this, because I've been throwing around, SPIIS latency and SPIIS request duration. It's important to understand the SharePoint page lifecycle to know what those numbers mean. So one half of this is your computer, and this is you sitting down, typing the SharePoint page into your browser bar, address bar, and then when you hit enter, what ends up happening is SharePoint page request goes out. It's intercepted or received by the web front end, one of the web front ends in the SharePoint farm in the cloud. That page gets processed in some fashion, and then what ends up coming back to you is that rendered page or one of the resources that are on that page. Because a typical SharePoint page, when you make a call for a SharePoint page, it's not uncommon to have approximately 100 files get returned to you if you've got an empty cache. It takes that many files oftentimes to allow you to fully render and interact with a SharePoint page. So a single request yields a cascading series of files returned to you. And if we break this down, so we make the request, the clock starts running. So this is where the timing loop starts. We issue our page request, and the page diagnostics tool starts a stopwatch, essentially. So the page goes across the network, traverses the internet, typically if you're going to SharePoint Online, or this might be your own internal network at a corporation, whether it's LAN or WAN. So the clock starts running. Now, the request is received by the web front end, but there's amount of time that's spent waiting. And that's what the IIS latency is. That's the amount of time that's spent between receiving your request and actually acting upon it. So this is when it's the amount of time that the request is queued before the web front end can start processing it. And so typically this is 0 or close to 0. If it's not, and we're starting to see numbers greater than 0, particularly if we get up into the double digits or triple digits, that's chances are that SharePoint environment's in trouble, because if it's taking, a couple hundred milliseconds to process your page spent waiting, as somebody who has run a high performance farm before, I can tell you a couple hundred milliseconds is an eternity. Eventually, the server ends up tipping over because you overflow your queue, and your request queue gets totally backed up, and the process dies and ends up getting recycled by normal health checking. So IIS latency, SPIIS latency is typically 0, might be, a handful of milliseconds of time. So at that point, once that period is over, you enter the processing pipeline, and the SP request duration is the amount of time that it takes the SharePoint web front end to process your page end to end. So at this point, SharePoint is probably pulling, the server might be pulling from some of its local caches. It's undoubtedly going against SQL Server to pull out data from the site or site collection that you're interacting with. It might be running queries, but pulling data off, interacting with other members of the farm and service applications. And then once that process is complete and the page is ready to go back to your client side, that's where the request duration ends. So it's the amount of time that we might spend in that processing pipeline. And then the page, of course, is returned and the clock stops. So if we look at this end to end, this is page load time. Page load time is an end-to-end measurement. Our first byte goes out and our first byte comes back. That's our page load time. So when we take all of these numbers and start to figure them out, and I put my TLE equation in place. So if I'm taking the page load time, which is the round trip going off to the server, and subtract from that the latency and request duration, which really make up the time that the request spends on the server, what I have left is the part of the page load that isn't spent on that server. And so this is time, what I call time lost elsewhere, TLE. Oftentimes it's network latency. It might be other processes not necessarily involved with SharePoint Online. So you can think about DNS lookups. You can think about web proxies, particularly authenticating web proxies. You may have asymmetric routing in place. It could be just about anything. But oftentimes this TLE is network processes that are not within your control. And if a SharePoint page takes a long time to come back in total, people oftentimes will blame the SharePoint Online environment when in fact it may be their own network that is the problem. Now, there are ways, of course, to get more detailed and more precise information on this to diagnose it closer, but you've got to start sampling at different points along the request pipeline or the request process. And as an end user, we oftentimes don't have that ability because we don't control once something leaves our machine. So we can, guesstimate that something might be getting lost in the network. And maybe we know some networking tools. We could do a trace route. We can do a ping. We could do a DNS lookup. We can use any of those ICMP network tools if they're available to us and we know how to use them. But this equation is what 95% of the people can use and report reliably to people who might be doing their support. So I want to pause here for a second to make sure this makes sense, because this is one of the key parts I'm trying to communicate. And I'll wait for a second.
Sean, we do have a few questions. So one question from Russell. What assets do you recommend moving to a CDN in which to public and private? As a side question, does the private CDN actually authenticate the user, or what makes it private?
So the first question was, do I recommend public, private, or both? Was that, or did I misunderstand that?
Yes.
What I would say, so I regularly speak to Microsoft about this. And of course, CDN has been a large focus over the last year or so, even more. they are taking steps. Most of the public stuff, at least as far as SharePoint is concerned, is being served up through CDN. Now, you may have items that are considered public for purposes of CDN classification. The only folks I would not recommend CDN for, or at least would check with the folks perhaps in their security area, anybody in a government situation, a government tenant, because I know that Microsoft was having trouble with the government SharePoint cloud and getting anything into CDN, but I think they eventually got to the point where they could do public. Now, whether or not you do private, that kind of depends on, you can classify public private, but private, it's really going to kind of come down to whether or not you trust things. Now, having something private in a CDN does not automatically give people access to it. But, once we got hit with GDPR, the reason Microsoft has to track a lot of the private stuff separately is because they had to put specific mechanisms into place where if a GDPR request was made to delete something from a cache that was housed on a CDN, they had to, within 1 hour, and they do this, they will, if they get a request that says get rid of this information and somebody discreetly identifies it, within 1 hour, that information will be gone. I try not to get too deep into what should be public, what should be private, and whether you should use one or both of them. But I do know that the SharePoint platform is using a lot of public CDN, and most of the stuff that developers are putting out there tends to be JavaScript libraries that they've written, SharePoint framework extensions, things like that. That stuff's all safe for public CDN because we're largely talking about files here. So, data streams, those are not going to be cached. If I'm making a live data request, that data will not be cached more often than not. So, we're not talking about any of that stuff. It's largely files. So if there are files you're concerned about, yeah, I would consult with somebody who's a CDN expert or security expert. But I would say, generally speaking, Microsoft has taken the approach that public is safe. Anything that's public can be cached indefinitely, oftentimes. But anything that you consider not sensitive information, not containing PII, things like that, yeah, go ahead and cache in a CDN because it's going to do a lot for you in terms of performance. The numbers are staggering. And then the second question was, it was about.
Does a private CDN actually authenticate the user, or what makes it private? That's what I'm curious about. I never really understood that.
That's a very good question. I honestly don't know, but I can take that away. In fact, I would ask that you send me a note and I can get the information. I'm sure I can point to a link that'll give you the information. And I'm sure I knew at one point, but unfortunately, it's not in my head right now, and I'm not going to say anything if I'm not sure about it.
Yeah, and on the first question, it was more like, is this just? I always think of images. If I'm all right, I want to use a CDN. It's images, and yeah, JavaScript files. But I don't know what else we should be caching. I always get this warning when I go into the admin center. It says, "Oh, you don't have caching enabled." I was like, "Yeah, I got a cache site over there. I use it, but don't know what they're complaining about, really."
Yeah, it could be, you can cast HTML fragments, particularly, template type fragments, CSS, XML. There's video, audio files. If you have actually take a look at the SharePoint blob cache from on-prem. If you want to go get one of the blob cache XML segments that was used in the web config, particularly with SharePoint 2013, all of those file extensions. Oh, PDFs, that's another good one. Those are good candidates for CDN. Excuse me. Anything that used to be in the blob cache is a prime candidate for CDN. So, Hopefully
And
that
this,
helps. A
yeah,
little bit.
so we would have to make a plan to store all those things in separate libraries that were cached versus non-cached. So it's an effort. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It is. I mean, it's not for free, but if you happen to have that sort of segregation already, or sites in particular, that are considered general use versus specialized, you might be able to break it apart that way. Just take the whole site and put it under CDN. It's entirely up to you. But yeah, it's oftentimes there's a little bit of work at a minimum that needs to go into it. I'm not going to minimize that.
Thank you, Sean. We do have an off-topic question about SharePoint VR, but we could probably save that until the very end.
Okay. Yeah. I'd be happy to, because, you guys have probably seen one of these before. So I do that as well as other VR. But I will get on with the performance talk, and we'll get through this. So if you're building your own SharePoint Online site, this is the one link. If you remember nothing else from this presentation, this link is your one-stop shop for what to do to improve your site from a performance perspective. Particularly if you're building out a new portal, this gives you top to bottom guidance, and it's well written and it's maintained. Every time I give this talk, before I give it, I go out and I see that there's new information out there. And sure enough, before this evening, and I was revising this talk, I went out and there was additional information. We can see that this was updated January 19th. So it's a little bit, it's a few months old, but nevertheless, I mean, Microsoft is updating this regularly. And this has everything you need from, conceptual down to practical information, including troubleshooting links, the SharePoint launch scheduler, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Microsoft has actually released a tool. It's more of an online service, but if you're rolling out a new portal, the launch scheduler allows you to stage your portal release in waves. And it includes all the necessary tie-ins to security groups and will help control when things go live. That launch scheduler is well worth the time you might invest in it. So, I would point you primarily to this site, this Portal Health site, because what I'm about to share with you in the remaining time we've got is, just some limited anecdotes from this, as well as my own experience. So the guy on the right in this image is Scott Stewart. And for those of you who don't know him, he's from South Africa, and he is the guy up in Redmond right now who, anytime you're trying to do something gear-headed with the SharePoint platform, chances are Scott's team is doing what they can to keep performance and everything running well. He's akin to a kind of a troll down in the coal room. He just keeps feeding the fires, keeps things running. Everybody up top continues to do their thing oblivious. But Scott's down there, and he and his team are instituting various servers. It's his team that wrote the page diagnostic tool. It's his team that has been handling all the Portal Health stuff and the launch tool. I met Scott a number of years ago when the page diagnostics tool was initially rolled out, because I was giving a talk on performance at the SharePoint conference in Vegas. And Scott approached me from Microsoft. He said, "Hey, I've got this new tool I'm rolling out. I'd like to make sure you have some information about it." And I said, "Well, why don't you come and present with me?" So we presented together. And that was the start of a great friendship. And he is the guy, and this is the advice that, he gives. I said, if you had to pick a top, 10 or, maybe handful of things you want to communicate to people, these are the ones he said. Keep your pages light with few references. Employ lazy loading if you can. Don't load your resources until a user scrolls down. All of the standard tricks that web developers have been using for years, but because of the way SharePoint runs, we didn't have access or the ability to include a lot of these in our pages. But nowadays, now that we're actually doing things primarily client side and not relying on server side capabilities and code, there's a lot more that we're doing, especially since we've got, our standard build stack with NPM, Yeoman, Webpack, all of those additional JavaScript libraries that SharePoint framework uses when you're building extensions, things like that. Employee caching where you can. The number one recommendation still remains, turn on CDN. And it's easy enough for you to do that using this PowerShell command. Now, note, if you're in a government tenant, don't run this because the CDN type, you don't want to set both to true. You would want to only set public to true unless you've had a conversation and gotten approval to use that. So, like I said, if you're in a government tenant, please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I don't know that the rules have changed yet. I don't tend to work in the government space, so I haven't gotten an up-to-date read recently. But don't forget the portal health. The troubleshooting guidance. So a lot of times, in many instances, I found that developers who don't factor the cloud into their designs tend to make several of the mistakes that are considered more common nowadays. Oftentimes, these are older developers like myself. I've been at this quite some time. I'm used to writing full trust code on the server. JavaScript has never been my thing. I do it because I have to, and because it's what most of what I'm building works on. But I don't consider myself a JavaScript wizard. It took me a while to start thinking in cloud patterns. And the biggest difference between the cloud and an on-prem SharePoint farm is in the cloud, you have less bandwidth and greater latency. And less bandwidth and greater latency can take any small problem you might see on-prem and make it huge in reality and in practice for anybody using SharePoint Online in your site. Oftentimes these, the less bandwidth, greater latency ends up getting us into this too many and too big situation. What that means is, we're making too many requests for files. The files are too big and it's taking, too long for us to get these things down because of their size most of the time. So I tend to say living in the cloud means living lean if you're a developer, or at least planning to be smart with caching and whatnot that you can use. So general guidance, use modern, not classic. That's one point that Scott Stewart beats up again and again and again. Do not turn on SharePoint publishing. SharePoint publishing right off of the top costs you about 200 milliseconds in your SP request duration. And that's what ends up happening when you end up engaging the SP HTTP module, or the HTTP publishing module for SharePoint. That module slows everything down because there's all sorts of checks. You're bringing into line all sorts of extra code that you can't use in the cloud for things like object caching, blob caching, etc. So just don't enable publishing. Try to do what you can with the modern experience. The modern experience is engineered for the web, and it's engineered to be highly performant. Understand your navigation options. This is an important one. On-prem, when we would create a new site, by default, that site would use structural navigation. We don't want to use straight old structural navigation in SharePoint Online because it is poorly performing and one of the greatest sources of performance degradation. There are other options we have available. Some of those will be here in a bit. Leverage search to your advantage. Search is very fast, and it has been fast since SharePoint 2007. If you wanted to do something quick, if you could tie search into it, search, because it has already built indices, is really ready to go. It's almost like pre-caching a lot of stuff. So anytime you can use search, and think of something like the content search web part, that's how you get speed. There are some performance trade-offs in terms of the content may not be the most recent, but if you can tolerate a little content staleness, search is a wonderful solution for any performance issue. Of course, understand any JavaScripts you employ and their impact. Don't just dump a script into something you're building without understanding how that script runs and what it does. Of course, follow the page diagnostics tool and cache everything you safely can, because the cache is only going to help you. So the current state of navigation, I was talking about structural navigation. For a while, we were in a rough position because once we took structural navigation out of the picture, we had search-based navigation, which involves customization to your navigation, which was not really easy to implement, or you had to use managed navigation. And so anybody who's used managed navigation understands that it's a great way to set up a menu structure, but managed navigation required publishing. What Microsoft has done since this trio of not great choices has been available is they've introduced something called cached structural navigation. And this is the best choice and what I think is typically on in new sites that you might build in SharePoint Online. Cached structural navigation basically does what structural navigation did in the on-prem scenario. Structural navigation worked in the on-prem scenario because we had the object cache. And if you don't know about the object cache, it's a chunk of memory that's used to store frequently accessed property, navigational, and other sorts of data. And so what would end up happening is a sitemap would get built. The building that sitemap is an expensive operation, but once it was built, site structures don't change very quickly. That could then be cached and referred to, and you'd get performance boosts from the cache. Well, when we went to online, we didn't have that object cache anymore. And so we were getting structural navigation, and oftentimes we were rebuilding that sitemap in order to present the navigational options. That is a slow process. Microsoft then turned around and said, cache structural navigation. We're going to cache this out in, I believe, CDN land and make it available. And that is how we now can use structural navigation again and have it be performant and optimal in most navigation scenarios. But don't believe me, go ahead and hit this link. This very easy to read link rolls right off the tongue. That's one that I would cut and paste if I were you. Let's see here. Oh yeah, one more thing. So I imagine anyone who's been in SharePoint Online has had or who has been there a while, probably.
Can you go back to that previous slide? I want to hit that link.
Oh, okay.
Sure. I don't know. How do you turn on cache structural nav? I've never heard of that.
It's in the site properties.
That's a new option or something?
Yeah. And it's on by default. You'll see a screenshot of it, I believe, in that link.
Oh, hold on one second. Let me grab that link. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So anybody who's been in SharePoint Online for quite a while probably has a classic site at their root. And, Microsoft is making the big push for modern. They're not getting rid of classic, but they've made it very clear that modern is what they're going to be focusing on going forward. And we also have these cool PowerShell commandlets now that we can use to swap a root site, maybe probably a classic site, and we can swap in a modern site in place of it. And for many of us, this is the only way to get a modern root site in our tenant because the tenant was provisioned with a classic site. So we have to do a root site swap. Well, there's a little bit of information you need to be aware of if you're not already, and that is this. So all my talk of the page diagnostics tool, if you're looking to do a root site swap and you've got more than 10,000 licenses, you're going to need to show Microsoft that you've got a clean bill of health with a page diagnostics tool before they allow you to do that root site swap. Previously, this guidance said may be required to run, and it now says will need to run. So Microsoft is being very clear at this point. It's no longer optional. If you're a large organization and you're trying to do a root site swap, you got to make sure that what you're swapping in is going to be semi-performant, or at least performant enough for the page diagnostics tool to give it a pass. So that's another reason you might have to get familiar with a page diagnostics tool. So what if your site's still slow? Now this is where we're talking about the TLE part of the equation. Everything I've showed you so far can help reduce your SP request duration, the amount of time we spend in the processing pipeline. It can also improve the semantics of interaction between the client and the server side. However, if you've got a problem or a network problem or something not related to SharePoint Online, you're going to probably have a high TLE. And if you've got that in your environment and you don't know what's going on, these are a few of the things that could be happening. You might have to whitelist Microsoft 365 destinations. You may have web proxies in the pipeline, especially authenticating web proxies. Your DNS lookups may be inefficient. Internet egress points, if you're in a large global organization, some of those organizations insist that you route across geographic regions before you actually go out to the internet. That is not the way that Microsoft 365 is designed to run. It's designed to run with you egressing in region. These are all of the different network items that anybody who's done their homework prior to setting up and using Microsoft 365 has likely addressed these issues and the problems that can be produced as a result of some of these configurations or hardware. However, if you're not sure, this is where you end up probably getting your network administrators involved and try to give them as much information as you can provide to help them help you diagnose the source of the problem. And of course, if all else fails, you can contact Microsoft Support Services. If you've done even some of the things that I've shown in this presentation and have some of that data to report, you're already going to be quite a few steps ahead, and I know it will be appreciated. So remember, you may think if you're just going from your client workstation to SharePoint Online, oftentimes you get into these sorts of situations. Web proxies will kill your connections and kill your the speediness, especially if you've got to authenticate to that web proxy, because then we get into claims handling and other sorts of authentication behavior. And this is just a simplified case of what might be happening in your network, but there are all sorts of other things that could be going on. So just bear those in mind. Those are not the places I would start. I would rule out everything that I have access to the information for. And that's why I tend to present the information on troubleshooting using the response headers and the page diagnostics tool. And if that fails me and I still can't explain the results, that's when I start talking to the network folks and talking about other potential items. So, any final questions? And I'll leave my contact information up here. I know I've been talking for quite a while. You guys are great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for hanging around. Any questions?
It's a great presentation, Sean. So maybe we'll jump back to that VR question. I think Mike wanted to learn a little bit more about VR use cases for SharePoint Online.
That's one of the reasons I've only tinkered and not done much in, I would say, a production sense with it. It's largely because I think it's really cool that they've added, Vermal and other VR type capabilities on top of a SharePoint site. I've gotten it to work, I've gotten it to work, I should say, on my HoloLens. I'm sure it will work on my any of my Oculus devices, but It's probably fair to say I think they've mainlined SharePoint Spaces at this point, and there's probably more capability. But when I was working with it, all they really had was the product, kind of sort of a product catalog site where you could put items out in a list, and they would have a VR representation of them, and they could be positioned around a room, for instance. It really wasn't much more than that, but honestly, I didn't go diving too deep into it because that's, as much as I want to do that, there are 100 things I want to do each day, and that just wasn't making the cut. So I'll have to go back and actually take another look at SharePoint Spaces. But if you've got some VR gear and you're keen on the idea of SharePoint with VR, I'm sure there's something you might be able to do with it. I know that it's been a piece of a few SharePoint conferences now where they've had SharePoint VR in the actual conference itself. I just don't know exactly what they've been doing with it.
Gotcha. Thanks for that update. Sean, we have another question in the chat here.
Sure.
This is coming from John. He's saying, can we please discuss the use of indexes in the use of large lists, like for sorting and grouping?
I would love to. I have not gathered any data or been able to develop any specific cases for indexes. Oftentimes I know with large lists, you live and die by indexes. In most cases, when I'm troubleshooting lists and problems with performance, I'm going to search, and search doesn't really care about how the actual list is indexed because it's getting that data from other mechanisms. But in the real-time query sense, I do know that indexes are important. I can't really say much beyond that because I don't have much experience, John. I'm sorry.
Yes. So in that case, Sean, I can elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure.
So, we're all familiar with the dreaded list view threshold that was introduced with SharePoint 2010. And I actually spent quite a bit of time debugging and troubleshooting and optimizing large lists. So back in the on-prem days, you could run a SQL trace and you could capture the queries that were being sent when you went to go load a SharePoint list. And based on how many rows were returned by the SQL trace would dictate whether or not you're hitting the threshold. So if you look at the underlying table structure, at least with the on-prem days, I believe you could have up to 9 or 10 different fields of the same data type within a given SQL row. So let's say you had 12 number fields or 12 lookup fields or others. It would actually take up 2 rows in the SQL database in order to be able to return that one item in the SharePoint list. And the threshold was set based on the number of SQL rows that were returned. So in scenarios like those, one might be to look at simplifying the lists or understanding if we can consolidate some of the columns, maybe converting the data types. But part two is, to your point, is to use indexes on those lists. And an index, think of a SharePoint list index akin to a SQL Server table index, which says if we're able to have enough, unique information, we can create an index, and by doing so, we don't need to go row by row and do a table scan to return back the items. We're able to look specifically at the index and then find what we're looking for much faster. So it's not a magic bullet that's going to automatically solve all of the performance issues. But let's say you are frequently sorting by a date field, or you're quickly filtering on a choice field that has several values. By indexing that, you could reduce that threshold that gets relayed on the SQL Server. That all being said, we don't really know what Microsoft does in SharePoint Online. Presumably, they're using, a mix of what they had before and probably some new cool stuff, which is probably how they're continuing to expand what those thresholds are in the cloud. But that being said, if you are having performance issues or if you are getting those large list issues and, you don't have time to archive things or, delete unneeded content, then yes, using indexes specifically on those fields that you're grouping by, sorting by, or filtering by can improve that performance.
Yeah. In addition to creating narrow views and other sorts of queries that do row limits and things, yeah.
What if the desired columns are not available in the index interface? Because I went to do this recently, and the list of columns that it would let me choose from to create an index was very, very limited.
Yeah. So in the documentation, you can see which data types are allowed to be. So like, for example, you can never index a title field or a free text field, because the point of an index is to say, okay, show me all of the content that's from this date and group it together so it's faster to get to. If just about every one of your titles is going to be unique, an index isn't going to give you much performance. It's still going to result back to a table scan. So yes, so there's creative ways that you can go and start to filter stuff. So for example, I've seen this before with, say, like phone directories, where let's say you want to show all of the A letters of people's names that start with A and their contact info, then B and C, maybe create 26 different views, right? Now, in a traditional sense, you wouldn't be able to just do a query or an index across that first title field, but you could, for example, write like a flow or something that could go to a number field and write out a number between 1 to 26, apply an index on that number field, and then you can use that to drive your filter in those list views. So you might have to get creative in some cases, but in most cases, just you got to split the data out. I hope that helps.
Good suggestions. Any other performance?
It was a great
questions?
presentation. I think it was a great presentation. I'm just curious about you were talking about the number and then server side. Is there an easy way on Page Diagnostics to see when it's maybe my network, my desktop versus the processing of the page on the Microsoft side?
With regard to which value specifically?
Well, I didn't know, like if it's like the overall time the page coming back. And
so the processing, I mean, what we see end to end, which is the page load time, that's everything end to end that encompasses the network traffic, and we can subtract out the part that it happens on the server as the IIS latency and request duration. The unstated assumption here is that the page, in terms of what our local system has to do, is powerful enough to the browser's going to do just fine with the HTML and render it. So the time spent within the browser is oftentimes negligible, but you can go in with those F12 debugging tools and you can actually see the render time and whatnot that your local browser would use. I don't even really consider that as part of the equation when I'm trying to troubleshoot these problems, because most of the time, the problems I've seen are somebody ends up with a page, it takes 14 seconds to come back to them. And they're going, what is going on? Now, if that request duration is maybe 10 or 13 seconds of that 14, I know that it's something in that page processing. But if the page processing is an average couple hundred milliseconds, then there's a network problem more often than not between the two. So
I see. So just eliminating the different.
Right. Okay. It's really kind of a, you can, but if it's 7 seconds and it's 7 seconds in the pipeline and 7 seconds on the network, the TLE, I mean, you may have a problem both places, or it may just be a bad day. Maybe there's degradation, or, more often than not, what I'll say is, before you assume a problem, go to your admin center in the tenant and see if there are any advisories that are posted, particularly about performance and processing, because something like authentication can make everything look slow if authentication isn't operating properly.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
It's one of those things, as you get into it more, you understand it more. Yeah,
Yeah, it really is. You can learn a lot just by watching the series of interactions. I know when I first started doing this, I couldn't explain probably 80% of the interactions going back and forth. But once I learned how SharePoint was doing it, as well as, when things were being served from CDN, what those URLs typically look like, et cetera, then it started to make a bit more sense, and you eventually get familiar with it. But yeah, when you're first doing it, it can be pretty baffling.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, folks. I appreciate you all coming. I hope it does you some good. If you ever have a problem you can't make sense of, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer it. But I hope the rest of the week goes well and you have a nice weekend.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean.
Yep.
And we do have a few closing out slides.
While you guys are getting settled, I actually created a quick poll inspired by this session, and wanted to see if people were interested in doing a dedicated session on CDN. There were lots of very CDN-centric questions in the chat, and I myself was asking at least half of them. So if you guys are interested in us doing a deep dive session on CDNs, please let us know here. Let us know what your thoughts are on it, and we will track down a CDN expert and get them to present for us. So please let us know. Thanks.
Does Bob German still live up in your neck of the woods? Bob German, works for Microsoft.
Oh, yeah.
Bob, when I wrote an article on CDN, Bob commented because he had written one similar, but it was more developer focused. I wrote one that was more admin focused, but the two of our articles together were kind of nice counterpoint to one another. Bob is extremely knowledgeable on CDNs, and I think he would be a great candidate. So you might reach out to him, and you can point your finger at me, and he'll probably curse me.
Yeah, we know Bob. He's presented for our group before.
I'm sure. Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, not a problem. Let me just put this back in presenter mode. Okay, let me know once you're able to see that.
Yes.
All right, so once again, huge thanks to Sean for the great topic today. I think performance is something that we've all struggled with at one point or another. So Sean, thanks again for breaking this down for us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we do have an open call for speakers, and we are interested in hearing from our extended communities here, both in the Boston area as well as our subscribers that are outside of Boston. And we have a variety of different topics that people have presented on over the years. And if you go to our website, you'll see all the past topics. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see the last at least 2 to 3 years worth of recordings. But that being said, we want to hear from you. We want to hear things that you're working on. Maybe just could be a 20-minute walkthrough of a project that you might have recently completed, whether it's a migration or a new intranet build or some other workflow that you've developed to help your team. We want to hear it, right? Part of this user group is to bring in experts such as Sean and others that we've had, but part of it is also just from a community perspective, share kind of what we're doing, inspire others to do something similar. And at the end of the day, if you have other things that you want to hear more about, but you don't know where to go, or something that you'd like to request out of us to find an expert on, please feel free to submit the same form and just put that in the notes field that it's a request and not a submission. And we'll be happy to work on with our networks to find someone that can help out there. So that being said, we do want to just highlight some of the upcoming community events that we have for the next several months. There's a variety of ongoing community sessions on different topics. If you go to the URL at the bottom of the slide here, the pnp.github.io, you'll have all of the registration abilities to come join these. So if you're interested in a little bit deeper dives into any of these things, these are great resources that are available free of charge. In terms of upcoming events, we are past March, so I'm not sure why that's still there, but we do have the Scottish Summit. It's not clear if it's online yet this year or not, but definitely check them out if you're interested. And it's not that much of a time zone change from the Boston area if you do want to attend. We have also heard very recently that the Collab Days New England, formerly known as SharePoint Saturday, is coming back in person this October. So the registrations are not up yet, but there is a call for speakers and call for sponsors. and at the very least, mark that date on your calendar. The plan, I believe, is to keep it in Burlington as they have in the past years. So definitely keep an eye out for that and block that day off. Thanks, Bill, for putting the links directly into the chat here. Are there any other community events that we're missing that anyone would like to highlight?
Dimitri, it's Chrissy. I just posted in the chat the M365 virtual marathon, and that's next month.
Oh, great event that happens yearly.
Oh, it's
Definitely
an awesome event.
check that out.
Oh yeah.
Chrissy, are you speaking this year?
I've been so busy, and I actually bookmarked the submit because I have spoken in past events, and I'm not sure if the call to speakers is still open because I've actually flagged it, but I've been so busy I haven't gotten a chance to submit. But if it's still open, I'll submit and I'll see if I'm accepted, but I'm not sure.
Awesome. Yeah,
oh,
past
and
events
thanks,
there
Sean, for confirming that Scott's handle. But because I thought it was, but the picture on his Twitter didn't match the picture you had. So it looks like he's growing a goatee, I guess, maybe. Sorry, Dimitri, for cutting you off.
I've used older pictures of his, and he bristles every time I show him the pictures I'm using of him. So whatever is out there on Twitter, you've got the right one. Scott Stewart, SA, South Africa. That's him.
Cool. That's what I figured. I figured since his handle had SA and it meant South Africa, even though he keeps his location as Redmond.
Well, he lives there now. He lives in Redmond. He's from South Africa, and he goes back every now and then, has family there. But yeah, he lives up in Northwest.
Oh, gotcha. Makes sense. Okay, thanks, Sean.
Sure.
Awesome. So in terms of some other recurring events that we have, there's a few other ones that are driven through LinkedIn, YouTube, or other channels. So if you're interested, definitely take a screenshot of this and check them out. Quick shout out to our sister user groups in the Northeast area. We have the Rhode Island user group, which is run by DRCS. We have the Hartford O365 user group that's hosted by Jared Batfess. We have the Granite State SharePoint user group that's hosted by Julie Turner and Jim Wilcox. And there's a few other ones in the area. I'm not sure if they're all 100% back with COVID or not. I know some went remote, some just decided to take a little bit of a break. But things are starting to open up again this summer, and I expect a lot of these user groups to be resurrected, especially these two that have so much interest amongst the community. All right, so pretty quick, does anyone have any problems or any tips, anything that you're banging your head against related to M365 or anything that you've solved that really was absurd, but you want to share with the team here?
Hey, Dimitri, it's Chrissy again. I've got a little, it's just like a minor tip, and it's actually just a reminder that of a nice, handy Excel formula that it's maybe not that many people may not be aware of, but it can be very efficient. Show of hands, how many of you have heard, are aware of text join in Excel?
Yep.
Say that again.
I am.
Text join. It's similar. It acts like concat. However, what text join allows you to do is that if you want to convert a text query into, if you have a long text string of, really bringing it together, concat is going to be just like unwieldy. Whereas text join allows you to do that. And it's just a little handy reminder for those that may not be aware or that it actually exists, because it is definitely a time saver. Or if anyone else wants to chime in on text join, feel free.
There's actually a handful of other commands that are text centric that have also been released.
Cool.
recently.
I love the fact that they've added views to Excel, although it makes it harder for me to get people off of using Excel as a database and moving it to a list now that we've got views.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah,
the whole thing
yeah,
at
they're doing some-
TechJoint is for analysis. Excel, modern Excel can be used as a good analytical tool. The current Excel is not the Excel what you may have been familiar with back in like the 90s or the early 2000s. It's like it's a whole different game changer in terms of analysis. It's
That's definitely true.
And Power Query on top of Excel is also something that's pretty cool if you guys
Amazing.
haven't played with that.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so
Oh,
just
yeah.
moving it forward, has anyone else run into any problems or weird things that have occurred?
I've got a weird thing that has occurred.
All right.
I have noticed a change in behavior in Microsoft lists around how you change views. So when you change views now, instead of it updating the URL to the URL of the new view, what it's doing instead is appending some code parameters with like a GUID of the view or something goofy like that to the end of the default view that you landed on.
Yeah, it's been doing that for a while. It's really frustrating. But if you
It
type
has
in,
been doing that for a while.
if you type in the URL that you desire, it will still give you the view that you want. So if
Yep.
I want to copy and paste the URL to
That's-
put it on a link somewhere, I go and I type in my
That's correct,
expected URL.
but most people aren't going to know that you need
No.
to do that, and they're not going to know what the URL for it is. So yeah, I think it's I would love to say that it's a glitch and that Microsoft will address this in the near future, but it's definitely been problematic, and it's particularly problematic if you have people who are going to a list and then changing the view and then want to go into grid mode. Because one of the things that this is not compatible with is the edit view. Or quick edit. I'm sorry, quick edit. I always call the view that I create for that grid. But yeah, if you enable, so if you land on a page and then you change, or a list or library, you change the view away from wherever you landed, and then you enable the quick edit, it will change the columns back to and give you the quick edit for the default view and not the view that you changed to.
I get a lot of tickets on this because people, when they're building menu items, they don't know what URL to use. So I mean, I usually just tell them to edit the view, don't make any changes, click OK. The URL will then update. Now you have the URL to use in your menu system, and so it's tricky for end users, and I frequently get tickets on it.
Yeah, so Mike, so the pattern that you're describing of the grid, the data grid view, or whatever they call it these days, going to the default view, that sounds like a bug. I think if you open a Microsoft ticket, that'll probably bubble up to the product group as an issue.
Anyone tried to create one of the I don't have my SharePoint in front of me. The card view, you can't delete it. If you set it up, there's no way to delete it. So don't set it up. I went to play with it in my sandbox and I can't delete it.
You can probably delete it if you go to the library settings page, or list or library settings,
and go in there, find the views. Yeah.
Do it through that interface. But yeah, a lot of the modern stuff is still not working very well for views.
Yeah, when I do like a card view, I'll save it as a view. So
that's what I did.
But I'll make a new view. I'll copy it first, make a new view, then apply the card to it, and then update the view. And then it's saved with that file. But it's tricky to get those galleries and those options to save with the view. You have to just edit it a couple of times, I find.
Yeah, and the save function I've also found is a bit flaky. I frequently do a save view as, even though I've already saved it,
Me too.
to
Yep.
just to get it to overwrite it and make sure that it's doing it right, and that helps a lot.
And I'll put right in the view like card or something, because that way people know it's saved with it. Because
Yeah, I had a weird one today. I was in an Excel document and I said, "Hi there, yeah, here." And,
Hi,
and
Yap.
Excel, hey, I was in an Excel document and I was creating a spreadsheet, and I saved a copy to the Teams folder, and then I went into file info to get the actual path after saving it, and then send that in a link to my boss. My boss like, "Hey, this link you gave me doesn't work." I'm like, "Wow, that's weird." And I clicked on the link myself and it didn't work. So I went back into the file again. I still had the Excel desktop open, and I opened it. Then I clicked on it again, and then I did a file save as, and I saved into the same location. It said, "Do you want to overwrite?" I said, "Sure." And as soon as I did that, the link worked. But the first time I saved it, the link was a dud. So
Wow.
Sometimes the duct tape and baling twine doesn't hook up right.
Yeah.
So I got
is there
one.
any chance? Hang on, sorry, Deb, just to respond to that one. Is there any chance you have forced versioning enabled on that library?
I could check on that. But again, it was just weird because, and again, the first time I saved it, I mean, you go, that's the gold standard, right? You go to file info, and that gives you the that hard short link.
Yep.
Yeah, that is strange. Deb?
So we had one with Power Automate today. So I have a list that I'm using SharePoint permissions. So I just wanted my end users to be able to add an option and not be able to edit what they've created. So recently we were required to enforce putting an attachment and make that required. And it turns out the attachment is actually done as a second step. So if you want to be able to do this, you need to use the edit or contribute, whatever you want to call it, the ability to edit content in order for that attachment to be moved over to the list. So it creates the item first, and then it edits the list by adding that attachment. Go figure that one.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We had a weird thing happen to us in our tenant, or this last weekend actually. So with a lot of our clients, we have our Teams chat federated so we can IM each other and whatnot. And for one particular client, it stopped working. Like I would click on it and it says, click here to continue your conversation, and it would kick us back into Skype mode, which would then fail to deliver. Completely bizarre. We had one of our support engineers dig into it. So it turned out that our tenant was still in Islands mode. We never switched it from Islands mode because we were always on Teams and it didn't really matter. And so was our client. And because both were in Islands mode, you can no longer talk to each other, despite everyone only using Teams. But we had other clients where we were in Islands mode and they were in Teams only mode, and it was working completely fine. So apparently Microsoft made an announcement about a year ago that this is going to be the new routing behavior. And I guess it either just hit our tenant or it just hit our client's tenant. So once we switched both to Teams only, then everything started working as it used to.
Huh. Good figure.
One way to make you make the switch.
Hey,
Just turn off
Dimitri.
functionality.
Hey, Dimitri, it's Rachel. It's
Hey,
funny
Rachel.
you say that. There is definitely something that changed. I'm in the middle of migrating from Skype for Business 2015 to Teams. And it used to be you put in a port order, the order gets approved, and you can start assigning the numbers right away to kind of stage everything. That stopped working. I just ported 70 numbers over. Found out today that I can't do it. But PowerShell is your friend. So through PowerShell, you can actually do it. You have to use a force, though, because now it's checking to see if you already are a Skype user. So there's definitely been some changes in the back end within Teams that are just like causing little hiccups.
Interesting. All right, so let's move forward. Next time we are still confirming with the speaker. So we will let you know through our newsletter once we get that figured out. But it will be the third Thursday of next month, which is May 19th. Thanks again to Turn Digital for being our platinum sponsor. Thanks again to all of our past sponsors, including Sean's company, which is on the slide as Akumina. That being said, we do have 2 raffle items. We have 2 Amazon gift cards